So she just kind of mentions in an offhand way, oh, by the way, I have this thing here for when the guns start going off outside my window, which is, a pretty intense moment. But of course, later, I'm going to flip forward a bit and we'll go back after. Later, much worse things are going on. So on page 54 in my book, this is October 9th, 1942. Today I have nothing but dismal and depressing news to report. Almost an apology, like I'm sorry, diary, to be such a downer. Our many Jewish friends and acquaintances are being taken away in droves. The Gestapo is treating them very roughly and transporting them in cattle cars to Westerbork, the big camp in Drenthe, to which they're sending all the Jews. Miep told us about someone who'd managed to escape from there. It must be terrible in Westerbork. The people get almost nothing to eat, much less to drink, as water is available only 1 hour a day, and there's only one toilet and sink for several thousand people. And so she goes on to describe the terrible conditions, and she has no idea. She does mention later that in the next paragraph, she says, if it's that bad in Holland, what must it be like in those far away and uncivilized places where the Germans are sending them? We assume that most of them are being murdered. The English radio says they're being gassed. Perhaps that's the quickest way to die. So she's very depressed. She's very sad. It might remind you of watching the news now from your home about things that are going on. Presumably you are not ill or not gravely ill, and so you're able to do this class now. But you might be reading about the way that people are really suffering so terribly in your own city or across the world. And I know when I watch the news, I'll cry and I'll just feel so bad that these things are going on. So it's a little bit like her. She's only hearing it through the radio, but she's observing things going on outside of her own little private annex, her own shelter in place moment. And she's very sad, but she's kind of reporting on it from a distance. And in the end, she says, she talks about, the hostages and how they'll just shoot people randomly if they can't find the person who did something in particularly. Fine specimens of humanity, those Germans, and to think I'm actually one of them. No, that's not true. Hitler took away our nationality long ago. And besides, there are no greater enemies on earth than the Germans and the Jews. So if you can think about that for a moment as well. My father grew up in Nazi Germany, and he always told me that it was very surprising. It was as if same as life in America, where everyone was just living all together. People didn't really think about it. Perhaps there was a little anti-Semitism or racism of some kind, just as there is everywhere nowadays as well. But people didn't think that it was going to erupt in this kind of a way. They just were living a normal life. So imagine for yourself if suddenly 75% of the people you knew in your own city suddenly were your enemy. She's saying that everyone that she knew before in her own country is her enemy now, and that she considers herself a different nationality and obviously a different race, a different background, a different everything from the people that were once, she felt some pride about that was her homeland. So those are showing some ways that she's really changing. Another thing that she starts to talk about a lot is that she's scared. So she and her mom are particularly anxious, and she'll have all these night frights. We'll talk about that as we see more of them later. But she mentions, for example, she mentions many times, but she mentions, for example, on October 20th, 1942, my hand is still shaking, though it's been 2 hours since we had the scare. And then she goes and she tells the story of how they thought that somebody had discovered them. I was so scared I nearly fainted at the thought of this total stranger managing to discover our wonderful hiding place. And just when I thought my days were numbered, I heard Mr. Kleiman's voice saying, "Open up, it's me." So when she writes, she's sort of very funny. She tells a good story, but if you can just picture how terrified she was and how she's living in a state of total anxiety. Again, similar to maybe some of the anxiety that you're feeling, that if you go out on the street, you might get sick and die, which is not, of course, likely, but a lot of us are facing those kind of fears now, and for some people, it has actually come true. So that is another thing to consider. Or themes that you can use as lenses as you read The first one I want to do is a writing technique. Anne is a really fabulous writer, and she gets better as the diary goes on. Her writing skills improve, which is exactly what will happen to you if you write this much in a journal as she does and do as much reading and studying as she does. But in particular, she has a few different techniques that she uses, and sometimes she's just narrating something that happened. She tells stories really well. But one thing that she does is she recreates a lot of dialogue. And that is something that I really want to encourage you to do, that when you create a scene, when you're telling a story, even if it's in your journal or if it's something else, that you imagine really well what each person said and that you show something about who they are by the way that they're talking and the types of things that they're saying. So, for example, on this is page 45 in my book, it's September 28th, 1942, she has an entire conversation between her mother and Mrs. Van Daan, and she'll say and actually everybody's in the room, and so it starts out with them kind of commenting on Anne's upbringing and what each person is putting in. This time, however, instead of addressing me directly, she turned to my parents and said, "You must have a strange outlook on life to be able to say that to Anne. Things were different when I was growing up, though they probably haven't changed much since then, except in your modern household." So everybody gets very catty and they go back and forth. Mrs. Van Daan's face turns bright red, and it says, "The non-flushed mother," Anne's mother, who now wanted to have the matter over and done with as quickly as possible, paused for a moment to think before she replied, "Well, Mrs. Van Daan, I agree that it's much better if a person isn't over-modest. My husband, Margot, and Peter are all exceptionally modest. Your husband, Anne, and I, though not exactly the opposite, don't let ourselves be pushed around." So you can see the character of each woman, how they're standing up for themselves. They're very different outlooks on life, on how to raise a family, on how to raise children, etc. And Anne, who usually, doesn't like her mother that much, seems to be a little bit proud of her mother in this section. But again, she doesn't say that. She just recreates exactly what happened so that we'll see it the way she does. And that's the writing rule I was talking about before: show, don't tell. So she goes through the entire conversation, and I think is a great model for how to recreate a scene and a dialogue. So definitely take a close look at that. And then it says, "Mrs. Van D wheeled around and gave me a tongue lashing, hard, Germanic, mean, and vulgar." There's the anti-German feeling again. "Exactly like some fat, red-faced fishwife," meaning a very low-class person who sold fish on the street. "It was a joy to behold. If I could draw, I'd like to have her sketched as she was then. She struck me as so comical, that silly little scatterbrain. I've learned one thing. You only really get to know a person after a fight. Only then can you judge their true character." Which is actually a very good point. But in other words, she's recreated the fight for us. She showed us everything that would happen. And by the end, we have the same perception of Mrs. Van Daan as she does, because she's drawn such a great portrait of her so very well. Now, the Robinson at Home by Weldon Keys. Curtains drawn back, the door ajar. All winter long, it seemed, a darkening began. But now the moonlight and the odors of the street conspire and combine toward one community. These are the rooms of Robinson. Bleached, wan, and colorless this light, as though all the blurred daybreaks of the spring found an asylum here, perhaps for Robinson alone, who sleeps. Were there more music sifted through the floors, and moonlight of a different kind, he might awake to hear the news at 10, which will be shocking, moderately. This sleep is from exhaustion, but his old desire to die like this has known a lessening. Now there is only this coldness that he has to wear, but not in sleep. Observant scholar, traveler, or uncouth bearded figure squatting in a cave, a keen-eyed sniper on the barricades, a heretic in catacombs, a famed roué, a beggar on the streets, the confidant of popes, all these are Robinson in sleep, who mumbles as he turns, "There is something in this madhouse that I symbolize, this city, nightmare, black." He wakes in sweat to the terrible moonlight and what might be silence. It drones like wires far beyond the roofs, and the long curtains blow into the room. On an Unsociable Family by Elizabeth Hands. Oh, what a strange parcel of creatures are we, scarce ever to quarrel, or even agree. We all are alone, though at home altogether, except to the fire constrained by the weather. Then one says, "'Tis cold," which we all of us know, and with unanimity answer, "'Tis so." With shrugs and with shivers, all look at the fire, and shuffle ourselves in our chairs a bit nigher. Then quickly, preceded by silence profound, a yawn epidemical catches around. Like social companions, we never fall out, nor ever care what one another's about. To comfort each other is never our plan, for to please ourselves truly is more than we can.